Everyone. Can you hear me? Wayne, are you there? Good afternoon, everyone. This is Aaron Thompson. I can't see you all, but I'm so happy that you could join us. This is our first meeting of the performance funding work group that we were called to do, and 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, actually. And the reconvening of this group is crucial. I mean, we're at a really interesting time in our lives, in our society, and in Kentucky. So as we look at higher ed and how we can continually add to making sure that we get through this and then recover heavily afterwards, this conversation that we're going to be having over a few months is crucial to the conversation to where we need to be in Kentucky. As you can see, we have a full agenda today, but before we start, I have to do some housekeeping stuff. First, this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube for the general public. All audio and video is being captured and recorded. Because this meeting is virtual, please ensure your audio and video are on when you're actively speaking. Likewise, please keep your audio on mute when not speaking to keep feedback issues to a minimum. Do any of you have any questions before we get into it? If not, Heather, would you please call the roll?
Sure. President Aaron Thompson.
I'm here.
State Budget Director John Hicks.
Here.
Representative James Tipton.
I'm here.
Senate President Pro Tem David Givens.
I am here.
President David McFadden.
I'm here.
President Christopher Brown.
Present.
President Jay Box.
Here.
President Jay Morgan.
Here.
President Robert Jackson.
Here.
President Ashish Vaidra.
Here.
President Eli Capilouto.
This is Angie Martin. I am President Capilouto's representative today.
President Neely Bendapudi.
Here.
President Tim Caboni.
Here.
Wonderful. Did I miss anyone? Okay, you are good to go.
Thank you, Heather. Heather is going to be our staff contact with all that we're doing along these few months. So please call out to her if you need her. If we look on slide 3, we have, this is our call to action, without a doubt, that was part of 164092. And it called us at 20 and 21 and every 3 fiscal years afterwards that the post-secondary working group shall convene to do these 3 main items. Determine if the comprehensive funding model is functioning as expected. In a little bit, we're going to give you some data. We're going to identify any unintended consequence or consequences of the model. And we're going to recommend any adjustment that we need to the model. The results of this review and recommendation of the working group shall be reported to the governor, the Interim Joint Committee on A&R, and the Interim Joint Committee on Education. Next slide, please. So you see some proposed dates. These dates are up to consideration and changing if need be. You can see that the short session of General Assembly will be starting January 5th, and we have to have the report done by December 15th and present it somewhere along those lines. The proposed dates are as follows: September 2nd, October 7th, November 4th, December 2nd. We could use all of these or none of these, if you will, kind of up to where we go, and we'll talk about that the last hour of the meeting today, along with a few other items that I know many of you have to respond to. So our staff that's going to be, slide 5, please. These are our staff contacts. We're collecting a lot of data to share with you. We've done a fairly deep SWOT analysis, and we have a lot of other data, obviously, quantitative and qualitative, that we won't cover today, but we hope to cover much over this period of time this fall. So you have David Mahan, who's the head of our data and advanced analytics. You know Bill Payne, obviously, who's been meeting with the CBOs for the last year on this subject matter. And you have Sean, who's working with Bill, who will be very much a part of the conversation along the lines. So any and all requests needs to be made to these folks. If you have those, you can make them to me, but I probably am not the one that would respond as fast as you want me to. Submissions, written proposals need to happen if you want some of these. So if you look at then the next slide, the resource material that we're looking at today mainly will be the goal and guiding principles that charged us in 2016, the post-secondary working group report, the performance funding statute we kind of already mentioned, the fund distribution through this year, 3-year average change analytics, trend and student success metrics, and the performance funding surveys, which all of you have filled out and you now have, or all the campuses have, that you probably got access to a couple of days ago. So if we look at the model, obviously thinking about it along the terms of a reason to do a new model, we in the past had what we call, just what we had before we built off of it, base plus. And so with this in mind, Bill, I'm going to let you take over a little bit and kind of explain some of the issues that we identified through a lot of resources, and let you talk a little bit about it here in a second. Just go ahead, Bill, now and talk now with this slide a little bit more.
Okay, thank you, President Thompson, and thank all the working group members who have joined us here today. We thought it would be useful since 7 of the presidents who are now sitting presidents at some of our institutions were not involved 3 years ago when the original performance funding model working group came together. Representative Tipton is new, State Budget Director John Hicks is new. We thought it would be useful just to have a handful of slides that provided you with just a little bit of background information. And as Aaron mentioned, we actually included in your resource materials the working group report from 3 years ago. We're not going to go over that in any detail today. But the reason that we got that working group together 3 years ago and developed a model for the universities and a separate model for KCTCS, there were several reasons for that. One was we were responding to a legislative mandate in the 2016 budget bill, House Bill 303. And the language in that budget bill directed the council to convene the working group and to develop the model, and that the model should focus on enrollment, mission, and performance. Also in that budget bill, $42.9 million, which represented 5% of each institution's base budget, excluding KSU, was carved out of the general fund appropriations from each institution and put in a newly created post-secondary education performance fund. And that provided some incentive for the working group to come together, reach consensus through negotiation, and decide on a model so that that $42.9 million could be distributed among the institutions, again, excluding KSU, once the working group completed its work. But there were other reasons besides the legislative mandate. Kentucky, from the year 2000 through 2009, led the nation in improvement on 5 key student success metrics. But between 2010 and 2014, that progress had begun to slow. And so we wanted to accelerate progress toward the attainment of state goals for higher education specifically our 60 by 2030 attainment goal. Aaron's already mentioned that there were some shortcomings of the previous method. We were pretty much using a base plus or base minus approach where every institution would get the same share of funding for the upcoming year that they received the prior year. And then lastly, we wanted to rectify some funding disparities that had developed over time. And you can see an example of those funding disparities in the graph on the right-hand side of this slide. This graph is showing the Kentucky Comprehensive Universities excluding KSU, and it's showing the net general fund appropriations per FTE. And as you can see, they're ranked in descending order of the amount of funding per FTE, with Morehead State University receiving the highest amount of funding per FTE at $5,709. Northern at that time was receiving the lowest amount of funding per FTE at $4,148 per full-time equivalent student. As you can see, beside the red bracket, Western would need about an additional $5 million, and Northern would need about an additional $10 million to get to the median level of funding, which was EKU at $5,029 back in 2015-16. So that was an additional reason why the presidents at that time were supportive of getting this working group together and developing a funding model. Next slide, Heather. We also felt it would be important to list the goals that were delineated at the time. This is what the funding models for the university and for KCTCS were intended to accomplish: increase retention and progression of students toward timely completion, increased numbers of bachelor's degrees and two-year credentials awarded. And of course, obviously, we wanted to produce more credentials in fields that garner higher wages upon completion. And that included STEM plus H, high demand, high wage fields, and targeted industries at KCTCS. And lastly, and very importantly, we wanted to close achievement gap by growing degrees and credentials earned by minority students, low income, and underprepared students. Next slide, Heather. I wanted to include this slide because I wanted to dispel some misconceptions that some of the newer presidents or newer members of the General Assembly or newer CBOs may have. And that is that the funding model was developed by CPE. In matter of fact, CPE brought options before the working group 3 years ago, and it was a series of critical decisions made by that previous working group that determined the structure, the components, and the metrics that ended up both in the university model and in the KCTCS funding model. And these aren't all of those critical decisions, but this is just a sample of some of those decisions. The working group had to decide, do we want to use a target and goals model, or do we want to use an outcomes-based funding model? And the consensus at the time was we wanted an outcomes-based model. In terms of the universities, there was discussion about should the research sector and comprehensive sectors be separate, or should they be combined in the same funding pool? And the decision was made to keep the university sectors together in one pool. Decisions had to be made about the major funding components and the weighting assigned to each of those components. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in the next slide. In terms of the metrics, decisions had to be made about what degree types to include. Were we going to include bachelor's degrees only, or bachelor's degrees, master's, and doctoral degrees? What, if any, premiums did we want to provide? And as I think most of you know, we ended up providing premiums for STEM plus H degrees, underrepresented minority degrees, and low-income degrees in the university sector. And KCTCS had those same premiums in their model, and also included underprepared students that there's a premium for in their model. How much weight should we assign to each metric? This next bullet was very important. The metric measures. Do we want to rely on counts of degrees and counts of student progression rates, or both? And the consensus of the working group was to rely on counts. And that, in fact, was the direction that a number of states around the country were going at the time, focusing more on counts of outcomes as opposed to things like retention rates and graduation rates. There was a decision that had to be made about how much weighting to give non-resident students in terms of their earned credit hours. Some institutions wanted 0 weighting. Others wanted them to count the same weighting as an in-state student. And ultimately, the working group decided on the 50% weighting. Next slide, Heather. This slide shows the Kentucky Performance Funding Model, and there should be an S on the end of model. It's the actual funding models because the major components are the same, both for the university sector model and for KCTCS. But it's showing the distribution of allocable resources, which quickly allocable resources is every institution's direct appropriation minus debt service and minus mandated program funding. So how should those allocable resources be distributed among the major components? Well, there were 5 major components. Student success, which had a 35% weighting, course completion had a 35% weighting, and then there were 3 operational support components, M&O at 10%, institutional support at 10%, and academic support at 10%. Listed beneath each of those percentages, you can see the basis for the distribution. I won't go into all of those, but for example, in student success component, the funding would be distributed based on share of student success outcomes produced. In the course completion component, the funding would be distributed based on share of credit hours earned. Next slide, Heather. This slide shows the metrics and weights for both the university funding model on the left and the KCTCS funding model on the right half of the slide. You can see that there are 3 progression metrics in each of the models. At the university sector model, it's 30, 60, and 90 credit hours. For KCTCS, it's 15, 30, and 45. You can see, as designated by the red bracket, those weights are graduated in order to emphasize progress toward completion. In other words, the weight increases the further along the student gets toward completion. So it's 3% at 30, 5% at 60, 7% at 90, and then a 9% weighting if those students actually achieve a bachelor's degree. You can see the premiums for STEM plus H, URM, and low income. There's the course completion component at 35%, and then the 3 operational support components. And I'm not going to go into this slide in any great detail, but those are the weightings for both the university and KCTCS models. Next slide, Heather. What I'd like to do in these next 8 slides is provide you some sense of what's in your packet in terms of the trends and student success metrics. And you've actually got 8 pages in your resource materials, front and back. They contain 8 tables and 32 graphs. And obviously we did not want to try to go through all of those today, but we did want to try to hit, some of the high points. This particular slide is showing bachelor's degrees and student progression within the university model metrics. On the left-hand side of the page, the chart is showing the change in bachelor's degree produced by degree type. And if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that there are 4 degree types: total bachelor's degrees, STEM plus H bachelor's degrees, URM bachelor's degrees, and low-income bachelor's degrees. And you can see what the percent change has been between 2013-14 and 2018-19 in each of those metrics. 11% growth in total bachelor's degrees, over 30% in STEM plus H and URM bachelor's degrees, and less than 1% in terms of low income bachelor's degrees awarded. I think it's important to point out, as you can see in the bullets to the right of the red arrow, that the STEM plus H and URM degrees are growing at 3 times the rate of total bachelor's degrees. That's some pretty significant growth. And also, despite the premium in the model for low-income student bachelor's degrees, it grew by less than 1%. And we're going to have to do some research to understand exactly what is happening in terms of the low-income bachelor's degrees.
Bill, let me jump in and just say clearly, when we look at the behavioral change that's happened on our campus, to focus on the URMs, that in fact can be arguably a success story. So I just wanted to throw that in as a way of thinking about some of the metrics and variables that are used with this model.
No, that's a very good point, President Thompson. And when you look at the weightings, both the URM bachelor's degrees and low-income bachelor's degrees have a weighting of 3% within the university funding model. But if you look at the size of the pool and the actual number of degrees that are produced, because the number of URM degrees produced is so much lower than the number of low-income bachelor's degrees produced, the dollar value of every additional URM bachelor's degree produced is much higher than that of the low-income bachelor's degrees produced. And so that additional dollar value might be something that we want to look at in terms of what's driving that progress in terms of the URM bachelor's degrees versus low income. On the right-hand side of the page, that chart is showing the change in student progression at the targeted credit hour thresholds of 30, 60, and 90 credit hours. You can see at 30 hours, there was actually a reduction over the past 5 years of 7% in the number of students progressing past the 30 credit hour threshold. There's been a decrease of 3.2% in progression at 60 credit hours, and an increase in the number of students progressing beyond the 90 credit hour threshold. And as you can see, the two bullets above the chart, we believe that the declining numbers of high school graduates and declining FTE enrollment over this time period within the university sector has contributed to reduced progression at the 30 and 60 credit hour level. But there's actually been some significant growth in the number of transfers, 9% over the past 3 years from KCTCS. And so we believe that those increased numbers of transfers are helping to grow progression at that 90 credit hour threshold. Next slide, Heather. We wanted to, kind of at a 10,000 foot level, show you, some of the primary student success metrics in the KCTCS funding model, and here they are. On the left-hand side of the page, it's KCTCS credentials produced by credential type. On the right-hand side of the page, it's again the student progression metrics at 15 credit hours, 30 credit hours, and 45. As you can see, in looking at the credentials by type, the high wage, high demand, URM, and targeted industry credentials are growing at rates well above that of the total credentials. And again, despite the premium in the model for low income credentials awarded, that particular metric grew by the lowest percent change over this 5-year period relative to the other credentials. And of course, the question that I would have is what would have happened with the low income credentials, the low income bachelor's degrees, had we not had those premiums in the funding model to try to incentivize growth in that area. Over to the right-hand side of the page, looking at the progression numbers, again, declining high school graduates and college enrollment contributed to reduced progression in the 2-year college sector across the board. And again, we believe that the growth in transfers before students reach the 45 credit hour threshold is contributing to the larger decrease in progression at that 45 credit hour threshold.
And Bill, I just want to add that Jay Box and his crew at our next meeting will do a deeper dive into all of the KCTCS data for us.
Absolutely. Thank you, President Thompson. Are there any questions at this point about some of the macro level metrics that we're looking at for the universities and for the KCTCS funding model? Okay, hearing none. Next slide, Heather. These next 6 slides that I'm going to share with you get into a little more detail on 3 metrics. We're going to be looking at STEM plus H bachelor's degrees and URM bachelor's degrees, which are the areas where we're seeing the largest growth in terms of the student success metrics in the funding model for the university sector. But then we're also going to look at progression at 30 credit hours, which is where we're seeing the largest decrease in terms of the growth over this 5-year period. The chart to the left is showing total STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced. And again, it's between academic years 2013-14 through 2018-19. And all of the university data is going to look at that same 5-year time period. But you can see that the number of STEM plus H bachelor's degrees are up almost 1,600 degrees or 31%. The STEM plus H degrees are growing at an average annual rate of 5.6% per year. And on this current trajectory, the number of STEM plus H bachelor's degrees will double by the year 26-27. So we're making great progress on this particular metric. Over to the right-hand side of the page, we're looking at STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced, but we're breaking it out by sector. The purple line is showing STEM plus H degree production for the research universities, and the green line is showing STEM plus H degree production for the comprehensive universities. And as you can see, the growth rate in the research sector is more than double that in the comprehensive sector. The growth over this 5-year period is 45% among the research universities and 22% among the comprehensive universities. I think it's important to point out too, that last bullet, that UK accounted for 73% of the increase in STEM plus H bachelor's degrees in the research sector. So a lot of that growth in the STEM plus H bachelor's degrees in the research sector has been driven by the growth at UK. And in fact, you can see that on the next slide. If you'll go to the next slide, Heather. This chart on the left is showing the 5-year change, 5-year percent change in STEM plus H bachelor's degrees over the same 5-year period that we're looking at. And you can see that 4 universities had growth rates above the sector average of 31%, and the sector average is shown in yellow there in the middle of the chart. But UK grew by 52% over this time period, Moorhead 35%, Eastern 32%, U of L 32%. And so about half of the universities were above the sector average and about half below. Over on the right-hand side of the page, what this pie chart is showing is which institutions had positive cumulative net gains in the number of STEM plus H bachelor's degrees produced. And as the pie chart shows, all 8 universities had positive cumulative net gains over this time period. And just quickly to tell you what that positive cumulative net gain is looking at, it's using 2013-14 as the base year. And it's taking each subsequent year and comparing it back to that 2013-14 base year. And it's capturing whether it's a net gain or a net reduction compared to that base year for all of those years. And then you accumulate all of the net gains and the net losses. And then we're only picking up those that actually had positive cumulative net gains in these pie charts. But like I said, in this particular chart, all 8 universities had positive net gains over the 5 years. But 80% of that cumulative net gain was produced at 4 institutions: UK, Eastern, Murray, and the University of Louisville. Next slide, Heather. Okay, the next couple of slides are going to focus on underrepresented minority bachelor's degree production. As you can see in the chart on the left, the system total underrepresented minority degrees are up 650 degrees or 34%. When you compare 2018-19 to 2013-14, that's an average annual growth rate of 6% per year, which is unprecedented. We're doing very well in terms of the production of URM degrees. On this current trajectory, the number of URM bachelor's degrees will double by 2025-26.
Bill, I don't want to call out any universities in particular, but I just want to say that Ed Trust just came out and said that University of Louisville was one of 2 selected public universities with more than 10% Black students. So, you know, that in fact goes to these numbers also. The idea that the more culturally competent we become, the more students we get and the more outputs we have from that.
Thank you, President Thompson. The chart on the right-hand side of this slide, again, shows the growth in URM bachelor's degrees produced by sector. The orange line is showing the research university URM bachelor's degree production, and the blue line is showing the comprehensive university bachelor's degree production. And again, as you can see, the research institutions are growing by 47% over this time period compared to comprehensive university growth of 22%. So the growth in the research sector is more than double the comprehensive university sector. And again, UK accounted for 79% of the increase in URM bachelor's degrees in the research sector over this time period. Next slide, Heather. Again, this next chart is comparing each institution individually to the sector average in terms of the 5-year change over this period. You had 4 universities that were above the sector average in URM bachelor's degrees produced: Morehead State, University of Kentucky, Northern Kentucky University, and Western Kentucky University. And the rates of change at Morehead and UK at 98% and 80% respectively. What a fantastic graphic, but they're growing at more than double the sector average in terms of minority degrees produced. Over on the right-hand side of this slide, you had 6 universities that had positive cumulative net gains in underrepresented minority bachelor's degree growth. 4 of those, UK, U of L, Northern, and Western, accounted for 87% of the total cumulative net gain. And as you mentioned, President Thompson, U of L with 360 additional cumulative net gain in underrepresented minority degrees, UK at 931. Our 2 research institutions are really carrying the water for us in terms of the production of underrepresented minority bachelor's degrees. Next slide, Heather. And I deliberately wanted to include this metric. I didn't want the working group to think we were just focusing on the successes in the performance funding model. But as you can see, the trend both in total in terms of student progression at 30 credit hours and the trends in each of the research and comprehensive sectors have been downward. Over the past 5 years, progression at 30 credit hours has been decreasing at an average annual rate of 1.5% per year. But I did not want to share this graphic with you without an explanation. If you look at the trend in progression over this 5-year period, it very closely mirrors what we're seeing in terms of the trend in undergraduate FTE enrollment. The FTE enrollment over the same time period was down 4.6% from fall semester 2013 through fall semester 2018. If you look at the chart over to the right, again, this is showing the breakdown by sector. The red line represents student progression at 30 credit hours in the research sector. The blue line, student progression at 30 credit hours in the comprehensive university sector. As I said, both are trending downward, but in the comprehensive sector, the downward trend is more than 3 times greater in terms of the percent change than it is in the research sector. They're down by 10% versus 3% in the research sector. Again, in terms of FTE enrollment, it's essentially flat in the research sector, and that's primarily due to growth in FTE at UK. But it's down 7.6% on average among the comprehensive universities. So both of these downward trends in terms of total student progression at 30 credit hours and in terms of the downward trends in both sectors is being driven by downward enrollment, downward trends in enrollment. And we had David Mahan do a quick analysis to look at retention rates over the same time period, and retention rates at every institution are either unchanged or have improved. And so this is not a factor of decreasing retention in terms of the retention rates. It's merely being driven by enrollment. Next slide, Heather. We only had 2 institutions that were above the sector average in terms of the growth in student progression at 30 credit hours. And those same 2 institutions were the only 2 that were above 0. As you can see by the yellow highlighted bar, the sector average shows that student progression on average among the universities went down 7%. If you look over to the right, those same two universities were the only ones that had positive cumulative net gains in student progression at 30 credit hours. And very importantly, EKU accounted for about 2/3 of the cumulative net gain in terms of the number of students reaching the 30 credit hour threshold over this time period. And as I said to President Thompson yesterday, I think this really points out a potential benefit if we utilize it correctly of the performance funding model. I really would like to know what Eastern Kentucky University has been doing to get their student progression at the 30 credit hour level to grow by 19% when most of the other institutions are seeing downward trends in their student progression. So that's something that we can, try to research between now and the September meeting and see if we can't get an answer to that. Next slide, Heather. Well, that's everything that I had, President Thompson, on the trends and student success metrics. There are more metrics. I only shared 3 in detail with the working group today. There are 5 others in that packet that's part of the resource materials, and I would invite any working group members as they look through that packet to please contact me or David Mahan with any questions you may have about any of those trends in the student success metric data.
That sounds good, Bill. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we're at the stage where we can turn this over to David Mahan to share with us the performance funding survey results.
And for those of you who are there, we will go through this fairly quickly, and in the end, if you want to ask any questions about any of these, please feel free just to jump in and ask those questions. So go ahead, David.
Thank you, President Thompson and Dr. Payne. So we opened up the survey in early July. I'd like to thank all the presidents for their expedited response and their thorough responses. We requested 1 response per campus after collaboration with cabinet and other campus leaders. And we felt like we received a very comprehensive response from each of the campuses at almost 100% response rate. And you can see in the topics covered that we looked at the state level assessment of performance funding, and President Thompson said things like 60 by 30 attainment goal and whether the model was in alignment with supporting those efforts. The second bullet there, alignment of institutional goals. So how is the performance funding model impacting individual campuses in terms of their budgeting processes, as well as their culture of student success? And then finally, the performance funding model calculations, metrics, and weighting. So we ask about every individual metric to get feedback on whether it was the appropriate measure, whether the weighting was correct, whether the calculation was appropriate. And then we ask if there were additional metrics that should be considered in the model. And so with all of this, I think it really struck me that we received, as expected, true advocacy for individual campuses and what could be changed to better represent that campus. But we also received a very rich perspective on the landscape in Kentucky higher education and what it means for all students in the Commonwealth and their families. Next slide, please. So I start with the overarching and maybe the most important question. Is this an improvement compared to what we did in the past, but compared to the across the board percentage increases in terms of consistency, fairness, and equity? So you see about an even split between the agreement and disagreement, with one campus omitting the question on the Kentucky four-year publics. And as you note, and all 3 survey responses in their totality are in the packet. So you can read through all the comments from each sector. And I would urge you to do so because we gave a good bit of opportunity for each campus to actually write narrative on how this particular question or this particular metric is impacting their campus. And so I would say that the concerns overall are really threefold. First, that we would need additional performance funding dollars to do true performance funding. That is just the carve outs and the competition for existing funds, is not what our vision should be. So that would be the first one. The second is COVID-19 and the influence that this pandemic has had on enrollment and budgeting. And the third, in terms of those metrics, those details, so can the metrics better represent all of our campuses in terms of mission? So for those campuses serving more rural communities or those campuses with smaller enrollment, can we continue to tweak the model to better represent their missions? Next slide, please. So as most of you know, the 60 by 30 attainment goal is our aspirations to get 60% of Kentucky residents to have a post-secondary certificate or degree by the year 2030. And so as Dr. Payne showed you, the increase in degree production has put us on trajectory to meet this goal, certainly in the short term. And performance funding has had a big hand in that, and most of the presidents do agree that we are lockstep with performance funding and the attainment goal. Next slide, please. So this question asks whether performance funding adequately focuses on low-income students and students of color. A really important question. And so for the most part, presidents did agree with this statement, but you'll note that, especially in the comments, that there are those campuses that believe we could do even more in our weighting and our focus on this group. Next slide, please. In a similar way, we ask whether the workforce needs were adequately focused on in terms of STEM-H degrees and workforce targeted credentials. And most of the campuses did agree with this, but again, there is conversation, especially on the KCTCS side, of what other workforce metrics could we use, such as training, collaborative training with employers that isn't necessarily for credentials, but just counting those training hours, or workforce outcomes in terms of employment in the state of Kentucky, or the wages in the state of Kentucky. And so there was much discussion of, additional metrics, metrics that might be about adult degree growth or production. And then on the other side, for the traditional age students, there was much discussion of things like dual enrollment and whether that should be included. Next slide, please. So this is a big one. And again, this is one of my three themes that really were the focus of our responses. So additional state funding is necessary for the model to achieve its goals for the state of Kentucky. And this was a strongly agree for most all of the campuses.
David, I just want to, are you there?
Yes.
Let me just say something about that one. I think it's important to understand that there are significant issues that we have. Obviously, most of it's around budget, new money, and the funding model to make it really work like it should work. The items that I want to give the presidents and their campuses really do on here is this question, because what it's saying is that they are willing to dedicate themselves to this, and it's shown that without the funding, but obviously it's at a threshold. Now it's at a place, a breaking point, if you will. And so all really feel that doing this would make those variables that they believe is crucial, those metrics that they believe are crucial to what we're doing in Kentucky, truly enhanced with more money put into this model.
Yeah. And so I think a couple of the presidents used the word vision in their comments on this on this statement to Dr. Thompson's point, because we understand the budget concerns and the revenue concerns for the coming fiscal year. However, the vision was certainly very much supported around additional funding. Next slide, please. So has performance funding distributions at my institution been consistent with expectations? And so this was certainly a mixed response. And again, we did break this out by sector so we could really look at, how those individual KCTCS presidents were perceiving it, as well as the Kentucky four-year publics. And so, for the most part, on the KCTCS side, it did meet expectations. On the four-year public, and this is mostly with our smaller campuses and that we're serving more rural communities, that their expectation was a hope for additional dollars that maybe did not actually come to their campus. Next slide. So this is the second theme of concerns, as I noted at the beginning, that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased my institution's concern. I think this is a pretty obvious one, but it is important in context with our funding model in terms of, the future work we do here. Next slide. My institution has changed its budgetary or other finance-related practices in response to performance funding. So our impression of this slide is very much about whether the model has been fully implemented. And you see an overwhelming response is that the operations and budgeting has been changed to align with the performance funding model on our campuses. The culture of my institution has become more focused on student success because of performance funding. So under Dr. Thompson's leadership, we've talked a lot about culture and what it means on a campus to really support student outcomes. And as you know, President Thompson is an international leader on student success. And this is an important question. So when we underscore the idea that are we more focused on student success because of performance funding, it's really important to see which campuses believe that they have enhanced their efforts in this area. And you see in the Kentucky four-year public side that about half respond yes and half respond no. And the comments are really rich around this topic because many institutions believe that they had been turning that corner with student success before performance funding, and they couldn't get more focused or more student-centric. But ultimately, many institutions were really positive about really galvanizing their efforts across campus to focus on student success because it really helps with their funding streams.
David, I just want to interject and say that slide, as someone who's written a couple of questions in his life, the more has a meaning that may not have been intended here. In other words, we know that campuses were focused on student success before the funding model. So it depends on how you read this question is probably how you ask. So the ones that said no, I'm sure, I'm not putting words in their mouths, but we kind of heard this through the conversations that we were focused on this before. It may have caused us to do some things differently, but it doesn't mean that we were not already focused on student success.
Next slide. So we asked what the appropriate level of stop loss, the amount of general appropriations that could be lost in any given year for a campus. And so right now, as it sits at 2%, most presidents were in agreement with that 2% threshold. We did receive a couple of responses about COVID-19, and it should be 0 under these conditions. And then we received some responses that we should increase this threshold as well. Next slide. So my last two slides are about individual metrics at the KCTCS side and on the four-year public university side. And so if you look through the 15 metrics for KCTCS, you'll see that first column there on the left, continue without change, is the majority of the 15 responses for the most part. There was much discussion as I started the conversation that we would think about STEM H credentials and high wage, high demand and targeted credentials in a different type of way, because there's much overlap with those metrics. So the idea here that we need to continue to enhance those workforce outcomes and think about things like on-site training with our employer partners, to think about things like dual enrollment, were really the themes for the KCTC side. Next slide. For our public universities, you see on the 13 metrics here that it's the middle column there, continue with recommended change, that was the majority of the responses. So here there was much discussion of the instructional square footage, the third metric from the bottom there. Many of our presidents talked about deferred maintenance and maintaining the instructional square footage that they currently have, and didn't have necessarily the opportunity to increase that square footage, which would be rewarded in the model. And so there was much concern in that area. There was also concern on the degree production, the yearly degree production. And so we received one response that talked about how we try to normalize that with enrollment per 100 FTEs, as we say, full-time equivalencies. And so, you know, this gets pretty technical, but I think the overarching theme here was my third takeaway, that many of our campuses believe in these metrics, and they affirm the idea that these are the right metrics, back to the work in 2016. However, some tweaking of weightings and kind of the technical application of these metrics could better represent our smaller campuses and our campuses that serve more of our rural communities. So I'll stop there and I'll let Dr. Thompson add any comments, and we can take questions.
Thank you, David. I'm going to just go ahead and finish out this deck here first, and then we'll open up to some questions if you don't mind. Bill, I'm going to invite you back to the screen, and once you finish this out on these few slides.
Thank you, President Thompson. These next several slides are under the heading of preliminary review. And first of all, let me say that we're referring to this review as preliminary because we believe it is the task of this working group to participate in and conduct the review that we're ultimately going to report to the governor and to the interim joint committee on A&R and the interim joint committee on education. So we definitely want participation from this working group and input from this working group to help us structure and finalize a review that represents the entire working group. So what we have shared with you today in these last few slides are simply CPE staff observations from looking at a lot of the data, from looking at the financial analyses, and from talking with some of our campus presidents and CBOs. With that being said, these are the areas where CPE staff believes the model is functioning as expected. Number one, no surprise, state funding is no longer being distributed based on historical share, but based on outcomes produced. And very importantly, that means that the funding is shifting and reflecting changes in enrollment, changes in program mix, changes in degrees produced, and changes in student progression. That next bullet, growth rates above the sector average, are increasing funding share for some institutions on certain metrics, and I'm going to show you an example of that on the next slide. We believe the model is providing incentives for increased progression and timely completion, and it's very definitely providing premiums for STEM plus H, URM, and low-income degrees. Based on conversation with campus chief budget officers and based on some of the survey results, we believe that the institutions are reacting to the model strategically, and we're seeing increased alignment between institutional goals and state goals for post-secondary education. A number of institutions have adopted internal budget allocation models to reward performance, and a lot of those performance metrics in their internal budget models are aligned with the state's performance funding metrics. We are seeing expanding emphasis on need-based aid and completion grants, which is very important. And then lastly, we were making some really good progress toward achieving funding parity. And that has kind of stalled in this third year of implementation of the funding model. We were at 6 out of 8 universities at funding parity a year ago. Well, we're now at 5 out of 8 universities at funding parity. And that's because we went from 2 years where we were distributing $31 million and $38 million, and we only distributed $15 million for fiscal year 2021. And so we more or less are just treading water in terms of trying to reach funding parity in the third year of implementation of the model. And that's why new funding is so important to help us get to that equilibrium level. Next slide, Heather. This slide shows excerpts from a 3-year average change analysis that was conducted by CPE staff at the conclusion of the 2021 iteration of the performance funding model. And you've got a complete set of the analysis in your packet. And it shows the same information for all 11 funding model metrics. But you can see, as designated by the red arrows, that I've included 2 metrics on this slide: bachelor's degrees normalized with a pool size of 46.6 million in 2021, student credit hours earned with a pool size of $181.1 million in 2021. In terms of those first 2 columns of numbers, what that is showing is how did the 3-year rolling average for each of those metrics in 2019-20 iteration of the performance funding model compare to the new 3-year rolling average in the 2021 iteration of the performance funding model. Those next 3 columns look at the volume change and the percent change. And then the status column is looking at who is above the percent growth of the sector average and who is below. You can see the sector average highlighted in blue for each of these metrics. 2%, 2.5% average increase in bachelor's degrees between the 2019-20 and the 2020-21 iteration of the funding model. Almost 1% increase in terms of student credit hours earned. In terms of bachelor's degrees, UK and U of L were the only 2 institutions that had growth rates above the sector average. And if you look over to the far right, you can see the impact on the percent funding share if you compare 2019-20 funding share to the 2021 funding share. So for example, because UK had a 5.6% growth and was above the sector average for bachelor's degrees, their funding share increased from 32.7% to 33.7%, a 1 percentage point growth in that bachelor's degree pool. And so that does indicate, and if you look at any institution that's below the average, none of those institutions increase their share. And that's exactly the way the model was intended to function. If you're at or above the sector average in terms of growth, you will not see any decline in your share. And in fact, if you're well above the average, you're going to see an increase in your funding share for a given metric. If you're below the sector average, you may see a decline in your funding share for a given metric. Next slide, Heather.
Bill, I'm going to take this slide if you don't mind.
No,
I
please
just wanted to kind of tell the audience, and then after this slide, we'll finish up the other 2 really fast so we can stay under an hour. But I just wanted to point out some of the things that we wanted to look at from a staff perspective that we found to be not what we intended when we put this together. As Bill said in the beginning, I was one of the people that's around this table that was there when this was created. And I can tell you that this is absolutely true in what we're getting ready to say. You know, for 3 straight years, the model has been implemented without no new funding. I mean, the intent at the time was truly to fund us, higher education, through this model, and it was crucial. So this has limited the funding to the redistribution of the base. And in many cases, this money came from institutions that really probably needed to build a bigger foundation towards student success and some of the metrics that we wanted them to do. And when you applied this in the same year as general fund reduction, the stop loss can result in some cases, in all cases, I think, like a second budget cut for some of our institutions. Unless action is taken, this is true, whether we want to talk about it or not. KSU, Moorhead, Murray, and 6 KCTCS schools could be facing, a financial cliff. And this is especially true when we think about the sunset. Set of unintended consequences that should be noted. Bill, I'm going to let you finish up this, and we're going to open it up to questions.
Thank you, President Thompson. Okay, Heather, next slide, please. This slide shows the implementation schedule and the funding sources for both of Kentucky's funding models for fiscal years 2017-18 through 2021. The first column in this table is showing the timeline, and year 0 was the first year that we distributed the $42.9 million, which was the 5% carve out from each institution's base funding, excluding KSU. And I'm calling that year 0 because it was a model development year. It did not include all of the universities. And in the actual statute, the first full year of implementation was intended to be and is the 2018-19 fiscal year when all institutions participated. In that third column that's showing the dollar amounts, the institution contribution, as I just said, $42.9 million in the model development year, which was the 5% carve out, $31 million contributed by the institutions in year 1. If you add the 1% stop loss to that recurring $31 million in the second year, 7.7 million added to the 31 million, it was 38.7 million distributed through the funding model. And then lastly, for this current fiscal year 2021, 14.9 million, which was the 2% stop loss. But most importantly, if you look at the column that's highlighted in yellow, that represents the new funding or additional appropriations provided by the General Assembly to fund the performance funding model. And of course, there have been no new dollars to support the implementation of the funding model over the first 3 full years of implementation. Next slide, Heather. And this gets to some of the unintended consequences as well. This slide shows the estimated budgetary impact of discontinuing the 2% stop loss provision, which according to the statute will occur in fiscal year 2021-22. And as we indicated earlier, there are 3 universities and 6 community colleges that are facing fiscal cliffs as we get into fiscal year 2021-22. You can see the universities and the KCTCS institutions listed there. That first column of numbers is the fiscal 2021 formula base, or what we also refer to as the adjusted net general fund. And again, that's each institution's total direct appropriation minus debt service minus mandated programs. That second column of numbers are the hold harmless allocation amounts that were calculated as part of the 2020-21 iteration of the performance funding model. But most importantly, if you look at that third column of numbers over to the far right, you get some sense of the estimated budgetary impact if that 2% stop loss provision were to be discontinued. A potential 38% budgetary impact at KSU, 32% negative budgetary impact at Hazard Community College, negative 23% at Southeast. Ashland and Big Sandy both have double-digit negative budgetary impacts. So this is something that I think the working group is definitely going to want to address over the coming months. Go ahead, Heather, to the next slide. And President Thompson, I think you wanted to finish up this last slide with the next steps.
Yeah, normally I would wait till we got through talking to say this, but I don't want to disturb any of our conversations just to bring this slide back up. So I'll just tell you what's coming up in the next couple of meetings. We will bring people from HCM strategists in to talk about how others around the country are doing with their models and how they in fact have implemented them and look at the results. We're going to be looking at financial impact analysis from our universities. We're going to be looking at KCTCS, which is coming up, I think, in our next meeting, looking at trends as well as analysis, financial analysis, and overall reviewing that. And so in the next coming meetings, we will have all of these and have some complete discussions. And we even have more data that we can provide to you. I want to thank Bill and David especially. I asked them to keep it under an hour and they did a really good job of doing that. Two guys who love data and numbers as much as these two guys do. It's kind of hard to do that. So I appreciate it, and Heather for advancing the slide. So yeah, we're just going to open this conversation.
President
up.
Thompson,
Yes.
can I just jump in and say something about that last bullet on the next steps?
Yes.
Individual institution reviews. You received in the last set of information that Heather sent around the materials for this meeting today, about a 4-page document that was sent to us by Northern Kentucky University. The heading on that document is the NKU summary statement about Kentucky's performance funding model. They submitted this to CPE staff as a supplement to the survey responses that they provided to David's survey. And I really like the way that Northern has approached this, because they took the 3 major charges of the working group and they responded to each one of these in their summary statement about the performance funding model. Namely, they said what seems to be working with the model as intended, what are some potential limitations in terms of the current model, and what are some considerations going forward? What are some potential adjustments that we might want to make in the funding model? And so what we would like to do is invite every other institution, and we'll send out a formal request to actually produce a similar document, no more than 2, 3, 4 pages, and just tell us, what seems to be working with the model as it was expected or intended. What are some of the unintended consequences, and what are some of the suggestions for change? And so we would like to get something similar from each institution to what Northern has already submitted. And I just wanted to give everybody a heads up that request is going to be going out.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to open this up without further ado, so we don't want to take any time away from the discussions that need to be had in this first meeting. Just know we have other meetings that we can have, so we don't have to spend it all today, but I just want to open it up. Who's first?
Aaron, I'll ask one first. This is Bob Jackson from Murray State. To Bill's last point, and I'm curious if this was anticipated by CPE staff or others when we look at the current distribution of funds. So we take the 2% stop loss that existed in the current period, so some $14 million. 2 institutions earned back more than the 2%. No institution outside of the top 2, the 2 largest institutions in the Commonwealth, no one else earned back their 2% stop loss, and 3 institutions earned 0. So I'm curious, did anyone see that or think that would occur in the modeling process, I guess, number one. And secondly, the issue of equity, when we talked about a lot of good performance measures, some not so good, a lot of opportunities for all of us. So how do you make those jive, I guess?
Well, Bob, I'll try to answer some of that. Part of that answer has to come from the intent at the time we put it together. And there's a few of us on the line, I would love to speak up and say something about it. But I don't think any of us intended that to be the outcome, by no means. Now, did we know that if funding started to be redistributed from base budgets every year, after several years of budget cuts, we knew that something could happen. I don't think we pointed to any one or two institutions to determine if that would be the case. I don't know how we could have assumed that, because we couldn't have assumed the kind of performance that these institutions would do. But I think, in fact, we did have an idea that if we didn't get new money in it, if distribution purely became a methodology of moving chess pieces around, that there would be some outcomes that could be similar to this.
Right. And lastly, in regard to that, I think that's the real concern. Without new money, we're simply taking the 2% stop loss and we're recycling it. And so there's going to be winners and losers among us without new money. And I've talked to most everyone on here in regard to that. I think that's the real issue, because there's the three smallest institutions for 3 years are at or near zero. And the largest institutions are obviously going to be the winners. And without new money, I think if you replicate this model going forward, you're going to see this continue probably for a long period of time.
Dr. Thompson?
Yes. Is that Dr. Morgan? I can't see your face. I think so.
It is. Jay Morgan, Morehead State University. Could you or Dr. Payne maybe walk through us very briefly, and I think I understand this, but I want the crowd to, the difference in the weighting of baccalaureate degrees among the various institutions?
Bill, I'll let you take that question.
I'm not sure I understand the question, President Morgan, the difference in the weightings between baccalaureate degrees.
So by example, at a regional institution, a baccalaureate is worth X amount of weighting, and a baccalaureate at a research institution, is it worth the same weighting, or the weighting's different?
Yes, okay, I understand your question now. No, there's a differential weighting between the research sector and the comprehensive sector. And that was the decision of the working group 3 years ago, when we were having those discussions about, do we include bachelor's degrees only? Do we include bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees as the metrics in the model? Do we include research in the funding model, or do we not? There was also some discussion at that time in order to reflect mission differences between the research sector and the comprehensive sector. As you may recall, I think you were at the council at the time, President Morgan. We looked at the differences in cost at various levels of faculty positions. For example, what was the average salary of a full professor at the research institution? What was the salary of a full professor at the comprehensives, assistant professor, instructor, and so on. And so the cost on average was higher for those same faculty positions in the research sector, because they're competing in a national, if not global, marketplace for their faculty versus a statewide or a regional faculty market pool for the comprehensive universities. And then lastly, as you may recall, there was a lot of discussion about, in the first full year of implementation of this funding model, there should be no redistribution between sectors. And so one of the other primary reasons for that weighting, in addition to reflecting that we were not including master's degrees and doctoral degrees or research in the funding model, and reflecting those cost differences. The other reason for that weighting is to ensure that there was equilibrium between the research sector in the aggregate and the comprehensive universities in the aggregate in that first full year. And that weighting is what achieve that equilibrium so that in the first full year that you implement the model, funding could be transferred between the two research campuses. Funding could be transferred within the comprehensive sector between those institutions, but not transferred from one sector to another. And that's what the working group agreed to. The one thing I will tell you about that weighting, and I've had to demonstrate this to a couple of CBOs over the past couple of years and a couple of institutional research directors. Once you have weighted degrees in one year and you compare the weighted degrees on the 3-year average in the next year, it's the same percent growth as if you were comparing unweighted degrees for that same institution in 1 year to unweighted degrees in the next year. In other words, the growth is the same whether you're comparing unweighted to unweighted or weighted to weighted. And so it's that percent growth relative to the sector average, which is, driving the change in funding share within the funding model. It's not the weighting per se, it's the percent growth.
Other comments or questions?
President Thompson, if I could, I'd like to circle back to President Jackson's question about did we anticipate that the two largest institutions would receive at least, what they contributed and more in this most recent iteration of the performance funding model. And Heather, I'm wondering if you can find this slide. I don't know if you can see this. It's in that section on the 2021 performance fund distribution. It should be right at the tail end of that 3-year average change analysis. It's a summary page that shows which institutions were below the average and which institutions were above the average on certain metrics. And there's a reason I want to show that. Are you on the line, Heather?
Do you know what slide it is?
Oh, you mean in the combined slides? I do not.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take some questions while they're looking for that slide and we can come back and ask about, let's not slow down the question asking or the statements while we do that. So I'm opening it up to others.
Dr. Thompson, this is Tim Caboni at WKU, and I certainly appreciate what the funding model has done. I think we all believe in student success, and on our campus, we certainly have shifted our internal operations to match with the expectations of ours. And I've quibbled with this since I've arrived, is that it feels, it's a growth model, right? And we know what happens demographically in the state in a couple years. I would like, as we have these conversations, to talk about efficiency. I think that is an important portion of what we do. I do worry sometimes that treating all institutions as though they're the same leaves some folks behind, and I don't want to do that. My larger question is this, and so I wasn't at the table when it was created. We want to, number one, we want to create incentives for behavior, and without additional funding, that becomes challenging. But more importantly, and I want to go back to the intent. There are some models, performance funding models, that are designed to shift money from one institution to another. Now, if we have additional dollars that go in, that doesn't affect universities as negatively as if there are no additional dollars added to the formula. But it does get to the notion of the stop loss that we have in place, right? We have the stop loss in place now. But was this originally intended to shift dollars? And we haven't talked about what the per FTE allocation looks like either. Those are two things that I'd like to see, kind of how that's changed over time. Has it made it more equitable in terms of the way in which state dollars are allocated per student? And then but the other is, was it really designed to shift money away from institutions into others? And if it wasn't, I think that's an important point for us to discuss.
Well, I'm going to invite Senator Givens in and Representative Tipton here in a minute. Senator Givens was there, obviously, We call him the godfather of this conversation. We'll at least call him that. I will tell you from my perspective, Tim, and I'm doing this because I was around the table as a president then, who actually was fairly loud in voicing what I believed. We knew there was a good opportunity you could shift dollars, but I don't think, from my standpoint, we felt that there wouldn't be new dollars in there. So we didn't feel like everybody was going to be losers all the time. We also felt like, or anyone was going to be a loser all the time specifically. And that's kind of the way I heard the question a little bit. And if I missed that, then correct me. The other thing too, we knew we had to focus on what was good for the state, to move the agenda with the state to build an economic system around higher ed that mattered. And so that's where the metrics came in. There was a lot of negotiation, a lot of back and forth among a lot of us, believe it or not. And it was a tough set of negotiations. But we also knew that it was important for us to move away from the base plus model that we had used in the past, because there were some institutions that Western was one of them, and Northern and some others that had really grown to do what needed to be done. So we felt like there needed to be a more fair and equitable way of thinking about distribution. Now, your argument, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, correct me, your argument is that that may have created to some degree an unintended consequence of inequity to some degree. And so I don't think any of us on this call, once again, I'm going to invite Senator Gibbs to step in, would have ever thought. We wanted all of our institutions to be healthy, solving the needs of the state, and we were trying to create equity and not inequity. So that's from my viewpoint, sitting around the table at the time. So Senator Gibbons, I'm anxious to hear your thoughts.
President Thompson, thank you very much. And I want to start by thanking each of the universities involved, each of the institutions and KCTCS for continuing this conversation. Aaron, I've been called lots of things, but I don't recall ever being called a godfather. And so that's one that you've made up off the cuff. Let's acknowledge it in front of everybody now. You're making that up off the cuff. Thank you in advance for acknowledging it.
Never will I acknowledge that.
Let me start by saying, and because it's been mentioned so many times, and it will be continued to be mentioned throughout our conversations, I want to be forthright and upfront in saying that my greatest disappointment, I take a lot of pride in the work I do here in the General Assembly in 12 years, almost 12 years of service. My single greatest disappointment has been the lack of new funding to flow through this model. The model was built and envisioned from the start for initially $20 million of new money to flow through in that first year of implementation. That would have negated a lot of the redistribution that is inherent in a model like this. If you look at the budgets that the governor proposed in spring of 2020, the House passed, and then the Senate even supplemented on top of that. Prior to us going into budget negotiations around the COVID crisis we face, I think the Senate budget had approximately $40+ million additional funding to flow through this model. That sort of funding would have negated a lot of the responses on the slides, and I've got my slides pulled up on the side. If I look at the slides and look at the responses of the institutions, both KCTCS and the Kentucky four-year publics, generally the slides tell me the model is working like it should, but for the fact there's not new money flowing through it. Now, President Capone, you touched on it, and I think it's important to understand we were concerned from the start about the growth question. We don't want a raw rush to numbers. We do want to incent performance, but we modified or at least demagnified that raw rush to numbers by using a rate change model versus a raw number growth model. How are you doing relative to the way you've done in the past? How are you doing relative to your other sector partners? And it's obvious to me, not pointing out anyone, but looking at the way some of these pie charts are shaped of where the leadership is coming from in underrepresented minorities, in bachelor degree attainment. Some are focusing with a linear focus on what they want to achieve and are being financially rewarded for it at the expense of those that are not focusing on where the money lies. And so I think those things will be things we'll continue to have conversation about. None of us could have seen the COVID situation. And really, I don't know that any of us could have seen the magnitude of the pension crisis. The pension crisis impacts this entire conversation in multiple ways. It's not just the KERS contribution, but all of the money that would be used in so many other places of state government, vitally important government services, is being soaked up by our pension contribution. If we had $500 million, where would you go to find it? You'd go to that supplemental TRS contribution that we have to make above the 13% statutory contribution. That alone is $500 million. We'd love to have 45 of that flowing through this model. Last quick point I'll make, and I'll make this multiple times, and President Jackson, this goes to something that you spoke eloquently about. And you didn't use these words, but the tone was there, and there's no criticism in me saying the tone is there, because we heard this throughout. Those of us that participated in the first discussion around this performance model heard this underlying tone. And again, there's no criticism in me using that phrase. Every institution wants to run back to the corner and pull out their calculator and say, what does this decision do to me today? That was a challenge we faced as Gary Ransdell led us through that first conversation around performance-based funding. If we can avoid that to the degree we can, avoid pulling out the calculator and saying, how does this impact me today? If we can say, how can I position my institution in 5 to 7 to 10 years down the road to be successful if this is the path? Those are the kind of conversations we need to have, because that reflects student success, which is all woven into that goal of 60 by 30. That's really the driving impetus for us to have moved toward this model. The model we had was not incenting outcomes. President Thompson spoke to the fact that we had hit a plateau. We were on a trajectory from 2000, when House Bill 1 was implemented back in the late 90s. We were on a trajectory to hit the national average for degree attainment. Sadly enough, we lost our focus around 2009, 2010. We had the economic downturn and the challenges with that, but we drifted away from the path we were on to reach that national average of degree attainment. And it has such a ripple effect in our rural communities, our urban communities, on quality of life, on per capita income. We know that that degree attainment is attached to so many other positive attributes in our communities and in our state. Refocusing this 60 by 30 is something we've got to do, and I'm a huge proponent of education. And I guess I'll end with this positive thought. President Thompson was presenting in a committee recently, and he had to run through a lot of slides because, as you know, we're on a tight time frame in the COVID situation with our committee presentations. And Dr. Thompson skimmed through a slide that I made him back up to in some Q&A and highlight the fact that thanks to each of you institutions, thanks to the leadership of CPE, despite the financial challenges that are being imposed on you, you've kept your tuition increases to a minimum. Thank you for that. Thanks for your leadership. And I look forward to continuing the conversation over the next few months around us making this performance funding model even better.
I want to jump in and say a couple of things, and I want to give Representative Tipton an opportunity to jump in and say something, and also Director Hicks before we move on. First of all, thank you, Senator Gibbons, for that statement. And in fact, I want to give our campuses and others really, and by the way, you too, representatives and senators who have congratulated us and thanked us for what we're doing. Our attainment rate has gone up substantially in our credentials and degrees. I do want to celebrate that. I don't want us to forget about that, even though we have some issues that we'd love to change with the model and get funding in the model. But it's gone up tremendously. We needed about a 1.7 increase per year to get where we needed to go by 2030. and we're doubling that. And so thank you. We also had some of the biggest gap closing in the nation with our underrepresented minorities through that attainment. So I with all due respect to what's not working, I guess I just want to point out what is working and let people know that this is big. And in fact, we did have the lowest increase in tuition at a 0.73 than we've had in 3 decades. So in fact, I appreciate all that we're doing, and I just wanted to interject that before we move forward. Representative Tipton, did you want to jump in and say something?
Thank you, President Thompson. I want to thank everybody that's been involved here today. And as part of this, just a little background, I know we've got a lot of new presidents here. I was not involved in the actual discussions of the work group. My role in this area did not begin until the 2017 session. Speaker handed me a project and said, here, you're going to take care of this and carry this on the House floor. Senator Givens gave me a crash course, and we were successful in getting the legislation through Senate Bill 153. I think nobody doubts that the intent of the model was that we needed new revenue to get to equity for all the universities. You fast forward to the 2018 budget session. Senator Givens has already made some of these points, but we made the commitment to fully fund the teachers' retirement system. At the same time, the Kentucky retirement system changed their assumptions, increased our rate on that side from 49% up to 84%. Took several $100 million of additional money. We've wrestled with this pension thing ever since then. We are going to continue to do that. And that is the one big obstacle we have to providing funding not only to post-secondary, but so many other issues. We have the last 3 years, we've frozen the rate. That takes money out of the pension system for all the quasis. That has given them some relief. That's another issue we've got to get our arms wrapped around. I was actually excited when the House passed our budget earlier this year. It went over the Senate, and as Senator Givens mentioned, they even put more money in on the Senate side into this. And if it had not been for this COVID-19 situation, I think we would have a whole different viewpoint of this right now. But we live in the world that we live in. And I think going forward, we have to understand there is a lot of uncertainty. I know that I was very concerned that our 2020 fiscal year was going to show a decline. We changed our revenue projections when we were in session this time to a more pessimistic projection. But due to some budget cuts, a strong June, due to some delayed income tax filings, we had a very strong June. So we had a surplus. And I think the key question going forward on funding, when we come back in January and look to fill out the second year of our biennium budget, is going to depend on what our economy does and how long this COVID-19 crisis continues. So we've got a lot of unknowns right now, but we have to reflect on that. And one thing I would like to be very interested in, I noticed the comments about suspending during COVID. I'd be very interested in knowing what the actual fall enrollments are at the university, particularly the freshman class, because I've been reading a lot of people talk about taking a gap year, that there may be decline first year enrollment and how that's going to impact. So when the universities give your presentations and as we get forward, you know what your enrollment is, that's something I'm going to be very interested in looking at. And we've got very excited to work with this distinguished group, and I'm confident we're going to come up with some constructive suggestions and see the best way to move forward. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Chair Tipton. Budget Director Hicks, we'll give you a chance to jump in before we start making final stuff. Let Bill get to his chart to explain to Bob what he needs to, but I want to give you a chance to interject some words.
Yeah, thank you, President Thompson, and thank the other presidents here. I appreciate your all's contributions. We were quite pleased, as Representative Tipton alluded to, to be able to not have to pull back $8.7 million from the post-secondary education institutions. That was a surprise and pleasing. And I appreciate many of the comments that Senator Givens has made about, kind of what was the inception intent of this. I'm looking forward to digging into the data with you. I wonder aloud about the interaction with some of the enrollment, the global enrollment numbers that you all showed here, and how a performance funding model works, with that environmental effect facing us, and maybe how we can turn around that environmental effect. There's several other things. I'm interested in causality on some of the both positive and negative trends. We see what the outcomes are. I'm very interested in why the outcomes are the way they are. And that had a lot to do with the policies and emphasis that you all put in your institutions. And I think that will inform other decision makers better about, well, why is the success the way that it is, or why is the lack of success the way it is. So I think we want to understand behind these numbers, what were some of the reasons for that. There are a number of things, that I'll be interested in on the data side down the road. Very disappointed to see the low income numbers. And I think everybody is. I think that's something, as a low per capita income state, we have a lot of growing to do there, a lot of improvement. And that's one of the things that I think that isn't sector by sector or institution by institution. It's the Commonwealth of Kentucky's concern. And so, but as Dr. Thompson said, some of the successes there on the other underrepresented minorities, and some of the STEM growth. Another observation that I noted, which was some of the increase in rates were more pronounced in the early years than in the later years. And so, so you all had to start this formula somewhere, right? You had to start with where you were at the time. But I'd be interested in understanding a little bit better maybe why the performance may not be as good in later years when the formula was more implemented than in the early years when you were just really taking into account what you already had going before the performance funding formula. But anyway, look forward to contributing and participating, and I want to thank the CPE staff for delivering a lot of good resources for us.
Thank you, Budget Director. A couple of points. I won't answer all this now because I think the presidents need to answer your question more completely than I would. What we do know is, when we look at it purely from a statistical viewpoint and from what I know about student success, we saw a lot of behavioral change in certain places. I'll use UK as an example, Angie, if you don't mind. They really started focusing on what we know are best practices to help all students, especially low income, such as moving a lot of their internal dollars to need-based aid, focusing on the last dollar gap, and so on. The other thing, too, is many of our institutions who were already I say this openly to everybody, already at the bone, when they lost money or didn't get new money, their baseline, they had to really redirect dollars to their baseline. When the pension, to be honest with you, when they had to focus more money on employer contribution, the place where it goes on many of our campuses, and a lot of people don't talk about this, you don't get rid of faculty. That's kind of hard to do. So you go sometimes to what I call those items that increases the likelihood of the most disenfranchised, such as the student support, social support, the needs, if you will. And then we had a declining enrollment process in many of our Eastern and Kentucky regions and some other regions. When you have less numbers coming in, it really creates, and you'll see this truly in the chart looking at progression, you had less going. So, I think there's a variety of, and I could probably, Budget Director, work some path analysis to show causation on these. I'll have to put my mind back in my statistical mode. But I mean, I would say there's a lot of that. The things that we saw on the positive end, when we saw the best practices go in full effect and money around it, you've seen a lot of output. I take what Louisville has done in really focusing on recruiting people of color on their campus, seeing that mentor, looking at what they've done with their students. So you're seeing a lot of that output. I'll give Louisville as an example. When the start of the funding the model happened, what they had done before, they had done a lot of that before, so their baseline was high already. So when we did the rolling average, to some degree, I'm not saying it was unfair, Neely. I mean, but you guys already had a high baseline on some of this. So when you looked at the sector increase, your first year or two, you suffered a little bit from that because you already were high, but other people that weren't got benefit to some degree. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of answers to your questions, and I'll let the presidents answer it more, and we'll provide you even more data because I think we have a little more of that to share.
This is Ashish Vaidya from Northern Kentucky University. Just a couple of quick comments. I know we're running short of time. First and foremost, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I think most of us, if not all of us, were really not part of the central conversation the last time this happened. So it is a fresh set of eyes and perspectives that bring there. Also appreciation for Senator Gibbons and Representative Timpton. We've really come to appreciate the work that you do in the General Assembly. And it's always good to hear from you directly about your commitment to higher education. Bill, I'm glad you called out NKU. My intent wasn't to tell the rest of my colleagues, hey, you guys need to write up something like this either. But NKU has the privilege of having an economist at its head. So it's just my way of thinking through some of those objectives. And I do appreciate, because I think we spent some time thinking through how we should respond to the performance funding model. Let me just make a couple of quick comments and turn it back to my colleagues up there. Number one, as someone new to both the state and to this particular approach, I firmly believe that an outcomes-based performance funding model is the right way to go, is the right direction. We now, I think, have a majority of states around the country in that direction, and it's absolutely the way to do it. While we tweak a variety of things, I think the intended consequence of student success is something that I certainly believe in. It's something, as Aaron mentioned, all of our universities have a commitment to. So that goes without question. I think the two or three other points that we've already made, and I won't go back to my summary statement that we presented. We've all talked about the extraordinary and unprecedented times we find ourselves in. And I know for a fact that all my colleagues, even though we're sort of in these virtual, remote, half hybrid operations, we've got a lot of things on our plate. Looking ahead to the fall semester, looking ahead to how we're going to manage the health and safety and well-being of our students, frankly, our campus community. We are many cities, as you all are fully aware. The timing of a concerted and a deep dive into thinking about very carefully about this model, it comes at a rather difficult time for all of us. And I would really urge us to put on the table the possibility of pressing the pause button, if you will. We've got very important things ahead of us. We want to make sure things get off smoothly. We've all spent months, the last 5 months, looking at different models and scenarios, and we're still in a very fluid situation. A couple of you mentioned about the uncertainties of enrollment. I think we're all paying attention to that. There is some benefit to not take a rushed approach to developing something, because I think this is the right direction to go. I think we can all seek improvements in how we can do this. I would certainly go back to the points we raised in this statement about sector differences and missions and cost structure, something that my colleagues, but the idea of, is this the right time to focus our attention on something that has implications for the long run, when really over the next 6 to 9 months, perhaps 12 months, we really have to have all our focus and efforts on the operational sense of how we get with the pandemic sort of worked out. So I just wanted to put that on the.
Thank you, Ashish. Any other statement from the presidents or anyone else on the line?
Aaron, this is Neely. Again, Ashish said it very well. Those were the few comments I was going to add. When I've been asked about the performance funding model and what I think about this, and as you noted, most of us are new to this particular process. I really do believe that it incentivizes the right things, outcomes focused. So I think the basic issue is this was always meant for new money and not really to redistribute just what we have. So very supportive, but I also completely agree with Ashish. For the Commonwealth, again, as you all pointed out, this was never about one university or one college versus another. This is about really advancing the cause of higher education, and not just for its own sake, but for the economic development and uplifting of communities that higher education offers across the Commonwealth. I do think that given where we are, the colleges and universities, in our system that are already suffering right now with COVID-19 could really benefit from no cuts to their base funding. Again, I'm a big believer in metrics, and we get what we manage, we get what we incentivize, but COVID-19 has truly, and also the racial equity issues that we are all confronting. The college and university presidents are truly, as are all of you, oh my goodness, Representative Tipton and Senator Givens and Budget Director Hicks, all of us are working on this. I would endorse our continuing the conversations, but not major changes for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Neely. David, Chris Brown, others that haven't spoken yet?
Yeah, Aaron, if you don't mind, David McFadden, Eastern Kentucky University. A couple of things I guess I would add, and I had the good fortune to be a part of this process, sitting in a different seat as we went through it the last time. But I do think that I want to echo a few things. One, Tim Caboni's talking about efficiency. That's going to be very important as we look at this model. As we think about maintenance and operations, institutional support, and academic support, all of our institutions, most all of our institutions are smaller today than we were in 2016, 2017, as it relates to the resources available to commit to those activities. Forecasting is going to be tremendously important. This process calls out that we look at performance funding this year, but it also calls on us to look at it every 3 years after that. I think we have to be very honest with ourselves about what the next 3 years look like for not only our institutions, but really for the Commonwealth of Kentucky as we start to predict the fiscal fallout of COVID-19. I think causality is something we've got to look at. I think Director Hicks, you talked a little bit about that digging into the data and understanding better why things that have happened, and understand what have caused them is going to be critically important. And then the last part, I think, is going to be when we talk about the outcomes-based models, we're talking about the outcomes at the institutions. I think we have to think broadly about what the outcome is for higher education as a whole in this state. And I think that there are many challenges in front of us. I would echo my colleagues' comments that right now the health and safety and well-being of our campus and starting campus in a responsible way and trying to keep our campuses moving forward is going to consume an immense amount of energy and attention over the coming months. And anything that we can do to try to put ourselves in a situation where we can focus on that, but also support the work in and around the statutory requirement for this issue would be very much appreciated.
And thank you, Aaron. I was trying to stay silent. I want to thank everyone for the work that's been done thus far for this working group. Kentucky State sits in a unique position under HB 303 from 2016 because while the state's public higher education hewed forward with the performance funding process, we needed to complete the management improvement plan, which concludes this year. And so we look forward to submitting that final report. As an academic, let me say I too can join the support for the outcome measures that have been selected, and I do think that they match the needs of the Commonwealth. And I think that the goals for outcomes for institutions are the right metrics. I look forward to observing and learning how the working group intends to nuance rates versus volume, percentages versus change over time. Because if you look at some of the charts, particularly one of the ones that Bill Payne was trying to get us back to, you'll note that even when institutions have the same end in terms of an outcome for growth, how that compares to their baseline and the entire volume, you can have a positive growth in number of degrees, but still have a negative percentage in the model. And so we look forward to seeing those things worked out. I trust the process and look forward to working with my colleagues.
Anyone else have any other statement before I ask you about the dates and if those fit into your way of thinking? And then hopefully we can have just a couple of minutes. Bill, I'll let you pull back up that slide to talk with President Jackson about. But any other statement from anyone? Angie, representing UK, KCTCS, Paul, anyone else?
Aaron, this is Jay.
Hey, Jay.
As you and Senator Gibbons know, I was on the original group, and from the very beginning, KCTCS has been a big supporter and cheerleader for the performance funding model. It makes a lot of sense, and as Aaron, as you and I have discussed, when I took over 5.5 years ago, I was already pushing the national completion agenda to get more of our students through the educational pipeline and into transfer or into work. So we've been very pleased with the results from the performance funding model as far as the outcomes. And we've been recognized nationally now. We've moved Kentucky up to number 8 in the nation in performance of credentials awarded. And I think we can be real proud of that. And it may have happened without performance funding model, but it certainly didn't hurt us to have that incentive. You saw the data, and I know we're going to delve deeper into that the next meeting for KCTCS. But you saw that the colleges, 16 colleges, were fairly split evenly in support and against. But that is primarily because of the lack of new money coming into the model. If new money would have come in, since all 16 of our colleges have improved, you would have seen 16 colleges give it a 100% check mark of approval. But I look forward to sharing more of our data at the next meeting, because I think I'll agree with my colleagues on this might be the time to pause, push the pause button for a year, but certainly we're going to be supportive in the future of performance-based funding.
Aaron, this is Angie, and thank you for the opportunity to add to the discussion. Of course, I went through all the discussions and listened to everything last time 3 years ago. And I would agree with everything that's been said with regard to the way the model is designed. It was not intended to just be a reallocation of existing funds. The intent was always to have new funding to come along with it. That in fact, the institutional contribution was seen to be a match. It's how the institutions were going to have skin in the game, but not necessarily be the only game. I think that is, we are overall, UK is supportive of the model. I think it does keep us focused on what we need best for Kentucky, which is increasing the educational attainment level. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. Anyone else that didn't have a chance to say something, need to say something before I ask you about the dates? I promised I was going to stick within 2 hours, and I will keep to that promise. The item that I will say on the dates, if you notice, we're skipping August because these presidents complained they had to open up their institutions. So I will grant them that they need to do that and do it well. So our next meeting is September 2nd. KCTCS will be giving us some in-depth knowledge with their data. We'll also have someone here from HCM to talk about what other institutions around the country and other states around the country have done around their performance funding. It's probably a good idea to see how we are working versus they're working. So if we don't have to discuss the dates in great detail now. I will ask you to contact Heather if you have concerns or any item that you want to list with this. What's going to happen out of this meeting? We heard some big, bold statements from a lot of people. We'll try to put those bold statements in some form that we can discuss as we start the next meeting. So we will not forget about what we said during this, not that you would anyhow, but just wanted to make sure that we stay on a linear path of having the information we need to present to the legislature in December. So Heather, pull Bill's slide back up. Bill, could you quickly share with Bob what you wanted to? And we have less than 2 minutes.
Heather, don't worry about pulling that slide up. What I'd like to do, President Thompson, is just make sure I've got President Jackson's question correctly worded. I believe he asked, did the working group or did CPE intend or expect that the two largest institutions would get the lion's share of any new funding? The short answer is no, it was not expected or intended, but I want to provide a more comprehensive answer that tries to explain why that actually happened in fiscal year 2021 at the next meeting. So we'll take that up then with the working group's permission. Another question that was put forward, or at least a data request, was from Representative Tipton. He said he would like to see some actual fall enrollment numbers. We'll try to have that information prior to our September 2nd meeting. And then State Budget Director Hicks said he's interested in causality. And, you know, I think great minds think alike, because I've been thinking the same thing, State Budget Director Hicks. I want to know why some of these metrics are growing and why others are not. And so I want to know some of the reasons behind the trends in the data that we're seeing. So did anyone else have any other data requests or questions that they would like for CPE staff to address between now and the next working group meeting?
And what I will ask you to do is, you don't have to answer that now, but spend a little time in the next week and send something to us. We don't want to wait. And you have the email up there for Bill and David. I mean, it takes a while to put some of this stuff together. So please don't wait a long time to give us those requests. If they come in late, it's kind of hard to have it ready for us to have any comprehensive discussion around it. First of all, I want to just tell people that our presidents and our campus constituency have been very transparent and very open and very honest in what they've shared. What I've heard so far is that everybody feels that, with the exception of a few metrics, that the performance funding model metrics are working. And there's some discussions we'll have next time after about those metrics that aren't working for them. And we've heard a lot of things along those lines, such as square footage and so on. So we'll talk about that. Lastly, I just will say that we know we're busy. We know that it's important. I will ask, and I'll say this from a CPE viewpoint, I represent what I think are the state's need around higher education to get us kind of where we're needing to go economically. And I also think it's important that I note that it's also around the quality of life as a whole, and not just the economic quality of life. It is important that we think about equity. It is important that we think about not leaving anybody behind, whether their income category is lower than ours or higher than ours. It's important for us to think about the gifted and talented, as well as those that are having some other issues. It's important for us to think in the future about quality. It's important for us to think about the needs that are out there that are ever growing in Kentucky that we'll identify more after COVID-19 is over and during COVID-19. But it's also, I think, it's important for us to understand that we don't do this without a healthy higher education system. And it's our goal, and it should be all of our goals, and I know it is to create that. And this funding model is a portion of that conversation, not all the conversation, but clearly a significant piece of the conversation. So I appreciate all of you coming with your best minds and having this. With that in mind, I've kept you your 2 hours. Unless you have something else you want to give us, then I'm going to let you go about your busy rest of the day, what's left.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you. Talk to you soon.